Um,
And it was A Toto, or what was the name of your show?
Tally-ho.
Aliho, sorry. It's been a long day already, and I just got back from Calgary.
Oh, no
And
problem. No problem. Yeah, but it's very cool to connect with you. Anyways, I've watched a few of your interviews, and it's neat to meet a PPCer.
awesome. Nice to meet you too, Pat. And thanks for inviting me to your show. I really appreciate that.
No, I appreciate you coming on. There's a bunch of stuff going on today, so I guess in terms of structuring it, I know we were going to talk a little bit about the sort of candidacy and the journey that is, but then I was thinking we can cover off some just world events, and there's so much happening right now.
Quite the world to have events in, I got to tell you. And yeah, there is a lot going on. There's not a day that goes by where we're not getting a little bit overwhelmed with what's happening around the world with the changes and the work that we have ahead of us as PPC candidates now.
Absolutely. And what would you say? I mean, today is tariff day, and so there's a lot of news in terms of Canada getting 25% on consumer goods, 10% on energy. And it was interesting. We're on Tuesday, March 4th. I just watched Jagmeet Singh talk about the fact that we're now in an emergency, and he's using that as a potential reason to say the people come before elections. So he's alluding to this
Hmm.
pushed out. And I was watching an interview with you and Jim Ferguson where one of the things that you were bringing up was, I believe you said that you think an election might be pushed out to next year, 2026,
The
and
latest, yes.
at the latest. Maybe unpack that a little bit and just talk through what your thought process is and why you think that might.
100%, 100%. And I'm sorry to break some hearts to Canadians out there, but no, Jugmeat made a deal a while ago with Mark Carney. And if Mark Carney ends up being the leader of the Liberal Party, he's going to get appointed, not elected, to the PMO's office, and he'll become the PMO. And then he'll be able to execute on this deal that he has with Singh, which is a relief package for Canadian workers. And Singh has already put out in the media some rhetoric around that. So it was very clear that this deal happened, and he's just waiting for Carney to actually be crowned King Carney. I use those terms purposefully because he's going to be a king. We are his subjects, and we can get into the nitty gritty of that, but this is where we're headed. And I do believe, and I wrote a Substack on, not Substack, a post on January 11th, exactly on this topic. So this isn't just responding to some new events today in the last week or so. I've been looking at this for months now, and what I laid out in that post was under the Elections Act, the fixed date is the 20th of October, 2025. And that's a calculation. I think it's like the third Monday of the eighth or the 10th month or something like that. But in either case, that's the next fixed date by that formula.
Mhm.
There's a motion that was brought prior to proroguing, which was going to move that to the 27th, which would have put a whole bunch of MPs into pension territory if they went ahead and did that, because technically the 21st of October is the pension date for a whole bunch of MPs. You need to hit 6 years, and because we had a election after 2 years, that actually worked out to be that. That was prorogued, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And then the second part of my reminder to Canadians was under our Constitution, we have to have an election every 5 years. So this is a constitutional requirement, which kind of puts like a hard limit at 5 years. But under the Elections Act, we had this formula that put a fixed date, which put us into October 2025. And then the next part of my post was, well, how would these change? Because a lot of Canadians are asking and demanding for an early election, including Singh saying, yeah, when we come back from proroguing, my first order of business is to provoke an election. Even though he made that statement and he was very clear. Singh's a smart man, so pay attention to the exact words he uses. He said Trudeau is a leader that he doesn't like. Trudeau. He never said the Liberal Party,
Mhm.
which means if it's not Trudeau anymore, there's a bit of an open door for him. And if there's an emergency, which was highlighted in his post as well, and I was tagging it to Trump's tariffs, if there was an economic emergency, I do see Singh working with Carney at least till October. And it's going to be the messaging, and I put it in my post as well. It's going to be in order to support Canadian workers during this time. And it wouldn't make sense to have an election during this battle with Trump and tariffs. So the messaging would have been very clear. Now's not the time. We're going to have a relief package, which is what Singh wants ultimately, and Carney's going to deliver it. And to dovetail on this a little bit there for you, Pat, Mark Carney is a very smart person. Okay, so he was the governor of the Bank of Canada in the UK. He's heavily connected on the global level of stuff. Look, we have a globe. I don't think that's a conspiracy theory. And there's a lot of people who work on the globe level, which is not a conspiracy theory. So it didn't make sense to me that Carney was going to come back just for a couple weeks as prime minister, which would have been in like an interim type of thing. I thought he was coming back to be a lot longer than just a few weeks. And that's why I put that post together. I kind of, connected some dots here. Carney's a smart man. If they were just going to have an early election and get into what would have been a slam dunk for the Conservative Party of Canada, then that's what would have happened. It wouldn't have been Carney. It would have been like Freeland would have been the PM for a little bit, kind of like a Kim Campbell of the situation, come in at the end just to lose an election. I even have a post or two about that she could be the Kim Campbell of Canada for a little bit. But when Carney announced he was coming back, that changed the whole game. He doesn't come back for a couple of weeks at all. So it looks like it's panning out. So even though it may
Interesting.
have sounded kind of crazy back in January that we can have an unelected PM, he doesn't have to have a vote by the people. He can be appointed by the party, which is then accepted by the Governor General. Then he's PM. That's exactly how it works in Canada. And if he makes a deal with Singh, it could be a long time before we have an election. And now it sounds like that's kind of coming together
It looks
because
like.
it was pretty obvious from my perspective, covering Carney for a couple of years, Singh for a couple of years, the deals that these two are willing to do, like between parties, and the ushering out of Trudeau was very obvious to a lot of us. And the wording that Singh used just before the proroguing, or as the proroguing was happening, it was clear he was aware it wasn't even going to be Trudeau. It was going to be somebody else he's going to negotiate with later. And he did, Carney. And Singh did communicate and have a deal.
And that seems to be part of the media narrative as well that has taken root with Canadians because a lot of them, and it's not a criticism of them, but from the people that I speak to, typically they will not necessarily investigate a root cause, and so they will go with what the narrative is. So right now, if the constituents I'm speaking with, a lot of their bugbears relate to the mass immigration, to the temporary foreign worker program, which is quite visible and it's quantifiable. You can see it. You can kids can't get jobs in retail. So it's the just the cost of living, healthcare. So a lot of these things, and they seem to follow this the lead of what I guess what the globalists that you're referring to and the media that seems to be in tow, which is they're connecting or pinning all of these issues onto Trudeau. Some of them are doing it on the Liberals, but they're not necessarily doing the deep dive root cause that these issues are not necessarily connected to one particular person or one particular party, but it's actually connected. It's actually a globalist playbook. It's not unique to Canada. It's happening across the West right now. And so I think that's from what you're saying is they're trying to do a little bit of a misdirection so that they're able to bring in Mark Carney and say, look, pin all the issues on Trudeau. We're going to have a fresh slate with this new fellow that's been parachuted in.
Misdirection. I don't know if that's a term I would use, but patsy would be a term I would use for sure. Scapegoat would be a
Mm,
term I would use. And it's, politically, it's brilliant. The strategy of the Liberal Party right now to swap out Trudeau, have five, six, well, they narrowed down the field, right? But at
mm.
one point, there was like six different Liberals all kind of saying, yeah, we screwed up. That guy screwed up. And here's how I'm going to fix it. And that was, strategically on a political level, brilliant because you're going to get a lot of the Liberals back, the Liberal supporters back, because that's why a lot of them left. They left because that guy was actually going overboard. We didn't like him. His rhetoric was bad. He was calling other Canadians names. We don't like that. And then having six liberals come, or not even six liberals, five liberals and an outsider is the way he liked to position himself, but he's very much an insider. But in either case, having six people running for the leadership saying, hey, that guy screwed up and we can do better, brilliant on a strategy for the party. And the second thing that I think they did that was stunning, I didn't even consider them doing that, was they axed the tax before the CPC could. So
Mm.
they got rid of the carbon tax conversation. So they took basically the biggest sale of the CPC party, sale used twice, right? They're selling us, and it was also what was pushing them along the water, was axe the tax, and they diffused it themselves. So they were able to get a villain, Trudeau, move him aside, take away one of the biggest talking points of their opponent, axe attacks, and polls are reflecting that rebound right now. We're seeing that rebound right now. That's working. That strategy is working for the Liberals. Look, I'm not a strategy advisor to the Liberal Party, but I can appreciate the genius behind what they're doing. And you can see that reflect because Canadians are paying attention, and the polls are showing that that lead that used to look like a super majority is now starting to look like maybe a minority or a loss for the
Neck and neck.
Conservative Party.
Right, and that seems to be exacerbated by the fact that some would argue Polyev is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory because he's going in with the globalist line on Ukraine in terms of these NATO forever wars, which I don't think
Yeah.
are popular. He's also towing the globalist line, some would argue, with the dollar for dollar tariffs, which are coming into effect now. So a lot of people think that that's avoidable and it almost feels like national suicide, some might argue, when you look at the numbers. I think 75% of our exports go to the US, whereas something like 20% of theirs come to us, and their economy's 10 times larger or something in that order. So the some argue that the rationale for that, it's actually an interesting point. Maybe we could segue to that, is people question why he would do that because from a political perspective it doesn't seem like it makes sense if you do. And they're well known for doing a ton of polling, and if you talk to anybody, the Ukraine war is not popular. I think NATO in general is losing popularity across the masses, which is something you wouldn't even think of a few years ago. But also in terms of dealing with Trump in a way that's belligerent. I mean, I don't think his track record shows that that's a good strategy. It's not going to end well. And so some would argue that maybe they're doing that because of the fact that we've got this globalist induced, basically a cratered economy. We've got something like 1 in 4 living in poverty. I don't know if it's 7 periods or 7 quarters now that we've had a declining GDP per capita. And back to scapegoating that we were talking about with Trudeau, maybe the globalists want to then say, look, all of these economic hardships that have been manufactured over the last decade, we can give Canadians who might not do deep level analysis around root causes, they can pin that on Trump at a time where a lot of people are struggling. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think they dropped the ball big, and I think the strategy of the CPC wasn't well thought out because they do pander, and it's unfortunate. This is part of Polyev's, I guess, Achilles' heel is he really wants to be liked. It's just something we see in Danielle Smith as well, so it might be a conservative thing where you certainly have a base that will support you, but you're also trying to be liked by more. And as you're doing that, you start to pander. Some people do, not all people. We'll get into Max in a bit. He doesn't do this, but because he pandered, that he brought in a lot of support that was willing to leave him quickly because he was just there for message and they came for message. So when they were coming for like carbon tax or Ukraine war and other things, he was pandering to them. And when people were leaving the Liberal Party in droves because of Trudeau and some of the things that they kind of got caught doing, like, yeah, they caused a big immigration problem. Canadians noticed. Oops. Yeah, they cause economic problems. Canadians noticed. Oops. When that actually, started to set in, Conservative Party pandered to those people. And this is one of the messages I was putting out there to Conservative Party members, which I think they should maybe pay more attention to now. When you pander, that puts you in a really bad position. You're going to have to keep pandering. And if you win on a pander, that's going to put you into a really bad position because you're not going to be able to work your base. You're going to have to continue that pander if you want to be elected again. I never thought for a moment that Pierre was looking at a single term time in the office, which meant there would be no way for him to lose that support when he goes in. So there's going to be a whole bunch of moderate liberals that were supporting him that he'd have to continue to pander to in order to do it. Now, here's what you're seeing the consequence of. This happened sooner than the Conservative Party was hoping, being exposed for the pander, because as soon as the other side pandered back, or at least provided back to their base what they wanted to hear, boy, did you see that exodus happen. So that's part of the challenge there. The aligning with all the other parties, okay, that's a different thing. That's not even pandering. That is uniparty. It does seem to be they have other alignments which are interesting. And this Ukraine war, even though the war itself isn't very popular, picking the Ukraine side is still the popular move here. Not picking the Ukraine side is very unpopular, as you're seeing with Trump and other people. So in Canada, it's still a popular issue now that if you have to pick a side, at least pick Ukraine. He not being strong on ending the war and stopping the war, and let's not worry about who's wrong and who's right, but let's stop the killing, more of the Trump approach. For Pierre not to take that position was a big mistake.
Mhm.
And that should have been a position he had from the very beginning, like Max. That was Max's position from the very beginning. And then I'm going to kind of land my plane on this one. If you're going to be a strong leader, especially conservative, you have to stand on principles. And too many conservatives saw that Pierre was pandering and not doing principle. And that's the challenge. Now, if you're a strong leader on principle, will attract support that will not leave you when the other guys change their messaging, because you attracted support based on principles and that didn't change. Even if they changed their messaging, principles didn't change. But if you're pandering, so you're playing in the messaging world, that's where you could lose the fight. And this is exactly what we saw happen to Pierre. Unfortunately, for the Conservative Party, he lost all that support almost in a week, overnight. And it's going to continue to lose that support when Carney wins, because a lot of that support is still contingent on Carney winning.
Mhm.
And when he wins and he starts doing payments with saying to Canadians, you're going to see the Liberal Party support grow quickly, because there's a lot of pain. You're going to buy off a lot of people, and because you didn't bring them over, I'm talking to Pierre on this one, because you didn't bring them over on principle, you won't be able to stand on principle after. So this is why he's aligning on a uniparty level more than you would like to see a Conservative Party do. And because there is a principle that he's standing on. He's not standing on a principle of no death. He's
No.
not standing on a principle of no debt, like
Mhm.
country debt. He's not standing on a principle of no division. So, oh, it's unfortunate, and we're seeing the effects of that happen real time.
And he does seem, I think there's a lot of conservatives that were rooting for him, and because he
I
was.
was look as a candidate for the PPC, I was rooting for a conservative shift, a pendulum shift, the Overton window shifting, and I really wanted. This is a lot of my critiques. Like I don't attack Pierre personally. I attack him in a certain way that I want him to be more conservative and more principled, because I would love a big shift to the right when it comes to conservatism in Canada. He's a little weak. He's a little weak, and I wished him the best,
And
but
that's
we're seeing the
interesting.
result.
And I think because he maybe lacks those principles, a lot of people that were rooting for him were projecting their principles or values on him.
Hmm.
He was a bit of
Right.
a blank canvas, and so he could just absorb that. But now that he's getting pushed into these decision points on Ukraine or tariffs, and so on, he's had to say something and make a decision, and that's showing that perhaps he lacks those principles and alienating the people. The other interesting thing that you're talking about in terms of that pendulum shift, right? If he doesn't have principles, typically conservatives are called that because they're interested in conserving things. And one of the
In the
criticisms
name.
of Polyev is, what is he actually interested perhaps in conserving? I mean, the globalist policies seem to be one, but beyond that, it seems to be a stretch to try and find what's in his core, what's really driving him.
Well, some of the things I'll give him credit for, because I'm very pleased that he did, denouncing the WEF, whether it was just an announcement or whether or not he genuinely means it,
Mhm.
not having any connections to his cabinet. Like, I love that announcement for sure. I was really pleased when he continued to have a parent first approach, and he would push for parent rights. Although there's a concession, he has the mindset that there should be limited parental rights, but at least he is pushing for parent first instead of child first, which is a liberal and an NDP type of a mentality. He's still pushing parent first, so I like that, and I also do like that he went with the common sense approach and the Canada First approach. PPC's been saying that for a little while, but I was pleased that conservative Pierre was headed in that direction because that's the right way to do it. Um, Frankly, I do give him credit every time he steals from us because it's the right path. So when he's stealing from us and then he's going out there with that, it does two things. One, it corrects conservatism a little bit. I'm cool with that. And it also validates the PPC's position a little bit more too. So I don't mind him doing that. What I do mind is when he doesn't go far enough and he's just kind of using it to position himself. For example, immigration. For longest time, he would say he would stop deportations, and then he clarified that to be deportations of students and workers' visas who are expiring. But my critique of him is it's still deportation. So if you've reached the point of deportation under our law because it expired or whatever your situation is, well, then you need to follow through with the rule of law. So don't say you would stop those legal deportations because you have a pander position, which is to reach out to the communities that support workers are they in a situation where they're going to be deported or students in a situation where they're going to be deported. Pandering to the community around that was a bad idea. I absolutely think he should have stayed on rule of law and he should have done the same thing that Max says is deport all illegal, not just protecting students and workers. And also another thing that Pierre did was he highlighted that he was for deporting violent illegals. So he added that violent portion to it, which also left a group of people that are supposed to be deported off the table. So if he would have had more of a position of rule of law, I think a lot more conservatives would have felt more comfortable with him. And a lot of people on the conservative side did question their commitment to him when he wasn't strong on items like that. And that's where we picked up support on the PPC.
And that's interesting. And it might go back to your point around pandering versus globalist uniparty, because one of the globalist policies is the UN replacement migration, which is basically
Yeah.
bringing in and completely changing the demographics of a country. And we're seeing that in lockstep. And so the reluctance to do deportations or to still be in favor, I think he said instead of the 500,000 or so temporary immigrants to come in. He wanted to reduce the immigration of permanent residents rather to 250, back to sort of the Harper era. So that's still a big number
Mhm.
if we've if we're trying to shift back and sort of offset the give some breathing room for infrastructure and and quite frankly just demographics in general to sort of catch up and balance out a little bit.
Yeah, and the way I look at this is I'm a visual guy in my brain, and I look at this like a pond that's overflowing and it's flooding everything around it. And then saying, well, let's just turn the tap down back to the original position. Well, you're just going to maintain the flooding then.
Yeah.
What you actually have to do is turn off the tap for a bit. Sorry, but because it's so overflowed, we're flooding, we're taking away our fields now. Like I'm a visual thinker. We have to fix that first. So that means removing all until the level comes down back to where are comfortable and we can work with it, and then you turn the tap back on. A little bit at a time too, mind you. But here's where we have some trouble, and a lot of my constituents and the voices online keep reminding me this. We have I think we can all agree, illegal. That's a line a lot of us can agree on, but we also have a legal immigration problem. This is something that comes up in spaces on X and stuff like that as well. Our system was changed in such a way, even under Harper, that we are not vetting as well. We're not focused on, the skills of Canada and the building of Canada. We have a very open humanitarian portion to our immigration beyond refugees. There's a lot of people who can come into Canada for humanitarian reasons that aren't refugees, and Canada will accept them. We get them in batches and stuff like that as well. So that's legal. That's legal immigration. So if we tackle just illegals, that will be part of the problem. But we flooded our plains not because of illegal, it's because of the legal stuff. So some of the things that I don't hear Pierre talking about is rolling back some of Trudeau's immigration policies, and fixing them. Okay, so we don't hear that at all. Going back to numbers, I think is an easy conversation with Canadians saying, "Hey, yeah, let's go back to Harper numbers. That's great," but you're still flooded. You're
Correct.
still flooded. You still have the problem, and a lot of them are legal now because of changes that the Liberals made to and UN. This whole thing that you were just talking about, relocation program. We need to fix some of that too. So this is where the PPC policies come in on immigration is we're going to revoke and change some of it, not just go back to some smaller numbers. We're going to put a moratorium on immigration as we now fix it. That's the next step. It's not just change the numbers and turn the tap back. We now have to fix it. So that means going through and revoking, reforming, and repealing some rules, laws, and policies around immigration. In addition to now, that will mean retroactively making legals illegal, and then now we deport. But that's also a step that I haven't heard from Pierre. And I think a lot of conservatives are wise to the talking point of the numbers, but they're also aware that we already have a problem. So we have to fix and actually deport a lot more than people are going to be comfortable with. It's going to be in the 2 to 5 million people range in order to get things back to where we are, and then we can start talking about bringing people back in.
Interesting. And I think the other layer on top of that that Canadians should start to get more comfortable with is people talk about legal versus illegal immigration. They don't necessarily go, and then maybe they'll go one bucket or one layer down, which is the unskilled versus skilled immigration. And a lot
Or
of
temporary foreign workers versus, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
And even
you're
the temporary foreign worker program has the unskilled bucket, which is sort of the one that's quite visible across sort of entry level retail jobs versus the skilled. But I think even below that, we should be looking at what's the actual mix in terms of demographics, because there's obviously a large concentration from a handful of countries. And one of the things I learned, I lived in Singapore for about 12 years. I actually bit of a detour, not to make it about me, but I grew up on the West Coast and then I went abroad for about 15 years, and a good chunk of that was in Singapore. And one of the things they do is they're very intentional. So when there's a mix, they try to bring in people from Malaysia. So there's like a Muslim element, there's an Indian element, and then there's an ethnic Chinese. And then there's sort of the foreigner bucket or Angmos, which is sort of what we'd call folks like myself that was there. But so even if you're going into public housing, they'll try to make sure that there's actually a distribution so that there's not a concentration of a particular group because they want people to blend. So if you think of it as like a food recipe, do you want to kind of put, all of these, a concentration of a clump of one ingredient together and not really blend them? You kind of want to have a bit of proportion if you want to have a melting pot. And I guess that's a little bit different than Canada's multiculturalism. But I'm going on a tangent, but I just think
no.
the next step in immigration is not just illegal, or illegal, legal, and then skilled, unskilled. I think the next layer is well, from what parts of the world, how does that align with our social values? How are we having proportionality so that when they do come in, we can be more of a melting pot? There's more integration, and perhaps there's less friction as a result of that.
You bring up excellent points there, especially around multiculturalism, proportionality, and then global migration. Some of the things you might be seeing is just the laws of number. Okay, so if you see, oh, there's a lot of people from China and a lot of people of India coming to Canada, well, those are also the two largest countries in the world with over 1 billion people. So if you put the population chart right beside the migrating to Canada chart, I think you might find it might overlap quite well. It doesn't seem to be disproportionate. It just is. It just seems that way because two massively large countries are immigrating to Canada. I would like to take race, religion, even sex off the table and focus on merit-based immigration and needs-based immigration. Primarily Canadians' needs, nobody else's needs. So, do we need certain workers in certain fields because Canadians are not fulfilling those? When those needs arise, a special ticket is assigned. That's what you're focused on, merit-based, not religion and all those kind of things. I liked what you were trying to get to have a nice melting pot mix. But when you do that, you're going to implement what I would consider to be racist policies because they're going to be defined on race. And as soon as you add race to the conversation or formula, you've done that. If you take race, religion, not gender, because that's not even a real word, but sex off the table, and even in the country of origin, like off the table, and you focus just on the Canada First needs, and the merit to match and nothing else, I think you might find Canada would prosper under that kind of immigration policy. And even though a lot of people would say that it would be unfair because maybe when you do a merit-based system, certain countries, I'm thinking like Japan and others, would do well under that kind of immigration policy. And that people may point out, well, after we've done this, it turns out we're actually only getting a whole bunch of highly intelligent Asians. Well, that's a merit-based system, and I wouldn't want to step in the way of that. And this is exactly how we built Canada to begin with. Anything else, any other knobs and levers and things that you want to add to that formula, you're not getting political. And if you're going to start using political identity, now you're getting into a particular world where I don't think Canadians want to be in, because those particular definitions get defined by DEI, SDG, these kind of
Right.
programs. And I would love to see all of that come out of all of our
Agreed.
formulas. And maybe we'll see what we have a merit-based immigration policy. What would it look like? A merit-based with Canadian needs-based policy, I think would be exactly what Canadians would support, enjoy, and prosper from. And we
I'm with
still would be immigrating a lot of people, but as long as it's under that philosophy and that model, I don't think Canadians would mind at all.
I'm with you. I agree on the merit based. I suppose one caveat I would bring up with the temporary foreign worker program, you may have employers that will justify a need to bring in a person, but one of the things I found was that in that regard, a lot of the temporary foreign workers in the unskilled category, they're subsidized up to 50% of their wages from the government, which means that an employer can get two workers for the price of one. So they might put a business case to say we need to get, these sort of folks. So I think we'd want to have some policy to ensure that that doesn't get gamed out by employers. Uh,
For sure. It actually, what you highlighted, there's a policy that needs to be removed because you
Correct.
just added country of origin to that. And Canada, being a country of origin, gets less preferential treatment to other countries of origin. So you got to take the calculate the country of origin out of the formula. And I do not like the idea ever. Even my son understands this. Subsidizing non-Canadians to replace Canadians is a racist policy.
I think it's appalling. I think it's appalling. I think a lot of people don't recognize the mechanics behind this policy. I think they see an overrepresentation of sort of relatively unskilled workers that are replacing locals, but they don't necessarily realize that the reason they're there is an employer can get one of them for essentially half the price as a local, and that other half the cost is actually being subsidized by taxpayers.
Right.
One point, just to go back to the different, again, SDG, DEI, I believe a lot of those are racist and sexist policies. But I do still feel there's an argument around having proportionality in terms of which countries are represented. And the reason for that, it isn't necessarily to prioritize one over the other, but I'm a firm believer that demographics will dictate culture. And if you happen to have going back to the pond analogy that's flooded from your perspective, um, let's say they're different colors of the spectrum represent different nationalities. If you can say, look, we've got a lot of red and a lot of blue dye, so we're gonna have a purple pond, or we're gonna have a red or a blue pond. I just think that's something where it's not racism. It's just more around saying proportionality to make sure that we don't actually become a satellite offshoot of sort of based on demographics of those folks coming in. And I know it's a bit of a sensitive topic to dance around, but I personally feel that Canada does have a national identity. We do have a national culture, and I think that if we're focusing just on merit and not necessarily having that proportionality, that if we do make that trade, we should be cognizant of the fact that we're probably going to also be absorbing or adopting probably a less proportional culture, and it's probably going to swing in a particular direction. And if we're comfortable with that as a country, then fine. But I don't think we should be blind to it.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit, and I'm going to bring your attention to Harvard. So, Harvard actually did this experiment that you're talking about right now, where they were focused not necessarily on merit, but on proportionality. and they were sued by, the Asian population and the other populations that were being excluded, even though their merit was higher. They were being excluded based on proportionality. The exact same experiment you're talking about there. And I'm just going to kind of point your attention to, even though I don't know if you intentionally meant it, but that is multiculturalism. What you've described there is multiculturalism. And you're basically trying to suggest using the term of a melting pot, actual multiculturalism. So if you're worried about one culture getting bigger than the other one, so you're going to bring in other cultures to kind of counter it, you're also accepting multicultural.
Hmm.
So if you look at a merit-based system, it really doesn't matter what culture you have because you're going to have a lot of people who are focused on building for their family, building their communities for their family, the next generation, building their own businesses, leaving a legacy behind. And that's going to be the Canadian culture, building Canada. And if you're all under that umbrella, it doesn't look like we need to look at that person's skin color or that person's religion or that community's, which centers do they have, which community centers do they have, and what do they lean to, because we won't have that. That's multiculturalism. What you'll end up having is really good community centers that have all that community there that are focused on building things up and not the culture of the people there. If the government gets in the business of dictating or playing with proportions of culture, that is a multicultural definition. So that's kind of where us Canadians, we grew up with that. We were told we're a quilt. We are a collection of a bunch of things, and that's multiculturalism. If the PPC is able to provide the identity back to Canada that we're talking about, we remove that. And that's why I think a merit-based system would give something that looks far more closer to a melting pot than if it did, we were moving the levers. And then the second part of this, do you really think it would be fair to Canadians, forget the immigrant, but for Canadians to get less merit but more culture based on a decision at the multicultural immigration level? You're not Canada first at that point, because what you would really want is the top brain surgeon, no matter what country he came from or she came from, the top one. Now, if we deny somebody and say, "Okay, look, your quota was hit for your country this year, come back, try again later," are we getting the best that Canada can receive? I would say even a few levels less is too many. So if we can stick to merit, I think we got something there. Now, maybe what we can talk about is a different type of conversation, and that is, where does everybody go, and where are we focused on putting everybody? And if we're not so focused on, like, let's build up one community here where a whole bunch of people come from, well, then you won't get what you're talking about. You'll get the melting pot. If we're encouraging people to go all over Canada, Alberta, Quebec, and whatever, with their skills, you're going to see it, not multicultural, but a melting pot. So I'm just going to push back a little bit because you're kind of
Sure, sure.
describing multiculturalism, but your desire is a melting pot.
It is, and I'm aware of the Harvard study. So I'll
That was
take
an experiment, right? They
yeah,
they were
I'll
playing with
take
the levers, and it didn't work
correct.
so well for them.
No, and I think it was one of those things where, and perhaps I'll clarify a little bit, and we don't have to dwell on it too much. But I know in the Harvard study, they were actually turning back a lot of Asian students who had exceptionally good test scores and extracurricular. They were all rounded, and they were getting basically turned away in favor of folks that had lower test scores and lower overall qualitative as well, from my
It was
understanding.
an open and published policy from Harvard. It wasn't
Correct,
even
yeah.
you didn't even have to figure it out. They were clear about it.
And so I wasn't advocating that. I guess I would be advocating I'm thinking of an overlay. And again, this is something that's a little bit dynamic, and I'm considering the inertia that we have based on the last 10 years, and if
Mhm.
there's any things. But I agree with you that merit should definitely be the priority, and then I suppose the thought process was more around, if we're only going to be having a very sort of boutique number of people coming in, if we had a moratorium on immigration first, and then we kind of slowly open the spigot again as people were coming in, then we might want to be intentional, at least for an initial phase, in terms of having more of that proportionality as the spigot's opening, to go back to sort of where it was. Because if we go a moratorium, I'm assuming we're not going to go full close to full open. And then during that phase, you'd probably have merit based first, 100%, not lowering standards at all. You want to get the best neurosurgeon or what have you that you mentioned. But then you'd be if assuming there's a surplus of applicants, and then maybe there's that initial phase, and then you get to a point where it's just full meritocracy. And that's kind of my perspective, and it's nuanced. But I hear what you're saying that we do want to kind of move away from applying quotas because ultimately I don't think those work either.
Correct. And one of the things we can do with merit is it doesn't have to just be aligning to the work that you're doing, proficient in English or French. Right, right there,
Mhm.
proficient, not just okay at. Merit means your skills. What can you do?
It's
Um,
quantifiable.
Correct. And then that's why I think that's going to help a lot of Canadians because what you'll end up getting is, well, you're not so concerned, not concerned, but you're not walking into a mall and you hear 50 different languages other than Canadian and English
Mhm.
because as part of the merit-based system, you're proficient already.
Yeah.
It may not be your first language, but it certainly is going to be your primary language. Education on Canada, history of Canada, the culture of Canada, not multiculturalism, but the actual culture of Canada. That's merit. Again, this is something that can be measured.
Hmm.
And that's where I'm headed with that. I don't want to even see country of origin, sex, religion. Like I don't even see that on the paper. I just
Hmm.
want to see, okay, well, they scored an 8 out of 9 or an 8 out of 10 for English and a 0 of French. Well, great. I'm in that boat. We can do that one. But that's what I would like to see. And oh, look, they got computer skills and they've got entrepreneurial skills or they've got the ability to actually create community. This is Canadian. And this is what I would like to see happen.
Hmm. No, excellent. One thing maybe we could just go back to for a minute. I know you were talking about Russia and Ukraine, and
Mhm.
based on the conversations or perhaps the polling data you saw, you mentioned Canadians by and large favor or side with Ukraine over Russia. So again, I feel like we fall into these false dichotomies. There's one good guy, one bad guy,
Yeah.
kind of like Trudeau and Polyev, or red team, blue team. Do you think what do you think it would do you think we'll and you talked about the Overton window as well. One of the things we don't see in the corporate media is any reference to the 2014 Maidan coup, which was Western led to Victoria Nuland. They basically installed and John McCain. They essentially installed a pro-U.S. friendly puppet government. And since then, there's about 30 biolabs in Ukraine. There's evidence that's quite clear of child trafficking and these sex rings, all kinds of pretty diabolical stuff in the Ukraine. So it seems sort of like a Wild West for the globalists. And that's quantified. And I think we might find Doge getting in there and uncovering a lot of that. And so we're sort of seeing it now. But I guess it's a roundabout question to you. Do you think we're going to start having that nuance in opinions with Canadians? Because right now they might get pulled and say, look, we don't want to fund any more wars because these things just go on and they don't seem to get anywhere. And on top of that, I can't buy groceries as an example. But do you think they'll kind of take a more of a helicopter view and look back and say, 11 years ago this happened, and this is actually the actual history of how we got to where we are as part of the just I guess mainstream conversation with people.
Okay, so there's a lot of moving parts there for sure. And I'm going to take you to Marxist dialectics. You familiar with that? This is a Marxist-based way to divide people based on a whole bunch of things.
Mhm.
And one of them is whether or not you support war, and then like whose side, and whether it's a humanitarian issue or is it a geopolitical issue. Like there's so many divisions around this issue that is kind of hard to start. But there's a big disconnect between the leaders of Canada and the people of Canada. Right now, we're not really working well together, and the government of Canada or the leaders of Canada are not representing Canadians well right now. There's a big disconnect, and it might be one of the biggest not disparaging, but differences in Canadian history. Like we're not being represented. So I do think if you polled Canadians, do you want to pay for war? And just pose that question. Do you want to pay for war outside of Canada or foreign war? Maybe we pose it that way. I believe Canadians would say no. Do you want to save Ukraine? A lot of Canadians will say yes. So it's going to depend on basically how you look at it. But to fully answer your question, I think Canadians are now getting to the point where, and this is a good thing if you want more conservatism, that socialism is not working. And I mean globally and locally. So the pain point for Canadians are going to be so close to their wallet and to their employment, like they haven't seen before, where they actually will care less about what's going on foreign and then
Mm.
also what's going on in their communities when it comes to helping others, because they're going to be focused on helping themselves. This disconnect from what they used to do, and I'm talking about like people that support socialism or social programs globally or domestically, they're going to have to focus on themselves. The war, the cost of the war, the money that's been spent already, and then the tariff stuff that's coming up. Carney already told us that he's going to go into deficit spending in order to fight against the Americans, he called it. And he also said he's going to use the Emergencies Act if he feels it's necessary in order to support his projects. Now, he said projects, which means the green program that he's pushing, plus this tariff war thing. I think what's going to happen to Canada, because we're on the wrong side of this issue, the tariff war issue. We're on the wrong side. I just want to put that out there. We should be working with our neighbor, not
Mhm.
fighting against them. But because of that, Canadians are going to be focused more on themselves because they have to. They got to eat and they got to work. And they're going to be less willing to do social programs, which means less support for the war. However, our leaders aren't going to change. They're not going to take that change. Even if the polls say 80% support against the war, the leaders are going to continue. Why? Because Carney currently, that's the only way he stays in office. He needs to stay in office under emergency circumstances because I think an election right now would not go well for him. And if he does this for long enough, Canadians will continue to wake up. I don't even think you'll be able to pay them enough for them to realize that every month that hamburger is now 20% more because this is going to be continuous inflation, is what Carney's proposing here. So every month is be 10 or 20% more for that meat, but your income is not going up 10 or 20% every month. Canadians will understand probably in 2026, we're broke. We can't afford this anymore, and we really need to fix this. At that point, I think Canadians, if they don't get an election and they don't have strong leadership as an option, that includes Polyev or the CPC, Canadians are going to get restless, and that might actually be good for the PPC. That might be a situation where it might benefit the PPC because the PPC is one party that said all along, don't do these wars, don't do the spending. We got video of Max from 2009 talking to Mark Carney, then governor of the Bank of Canada, and in 2009, Max is saying to him, "You need to drop the target inflation rate from 2% to 0% because over the last 10 years or so, maybe a little bit more than that, 16 years or so, you basically almost doubled the cost of goods. Like, I think it was 70 cents to the dollar at that
I've seen
point.
that. I've seen that video. Yeah, this was.
But today, if you continue that calculation and that warning from Max, if you could continue it to today, they actually did 2.5% inflation, and we're now down at 49 cents to the dollar of the 1990 dollar. Yeah, $1990. So the beginning of that calculation. So Max was bang on in 2009, warning your cost of goods is going to go up, your value of your dollar is going to go down, and this is going to lead to a depression of the Canadian dollar. And he said this in 2009 to Mark Carney, who was appointed by
Yeah.
Harper at that time,
Mhm.
to beware. Mark Carney's response was, well, this is in line with global needs. So we're going to continue with this. And the Americans are doing it too. So we're going to do it too. He acknowledged that it was absolutely a hidden tax, was the term used. So inflation's a hidden tax. He acknowledged it and condoned it.
He kind of did it indirectly though, because I did watch that video where Max Bernier did ask him to acknowledge that inflation is in fact a tax, and I know he did a little bit of a word salad answer, and I don't recall him explicitly acknowledging that, but maybe
Oh,
he
yeah. So here's where we push back a bit, Pat. It wasn't word salad. I
did.
understood every word that he said. He had several things that he said there, and it was justification of the 2%. Now, he also acknowledged that the inflation would cause a depression of the dollar and you'd have less buying power. And his justification there was everybody else is doing it, so we're going to do it. So that's how I get to the acknowledgement. He didn't have to
Yeah.
say inflation is a tax, but he did justify it. And that is a way of acknowledging.
I guess so.
acknowledgement.
Yeah. I mean, I watched it as well, and I mean, I was following what he was saying, but I didn't feel there was a lot of substance in terms of
Oh, he said some hard thing. Every single
yeah,
sentence was a nail in the coffin for Canada. If you
yeah,
understood precisely what he was saying, especially when he was saying the U.S. is doing it, this is a global target, and the government sets this, not me. So, in other words, if you guys want to change it, go ahead and change it. And that would have been a
mhm.
conservative party at the time, and they didn't. But his recommendation is what the government is doing. So he kind
And
of that's
that
he
they were
flipped
staying
it,
at
right?
2%. Yeah,
Yeah,
and that they were staying at that point within the 2% target of inflation, and everybody else is doing it as a globalist. I mean, it goes back to central banking, but ultimately
correct.
it's
Yeah.
eroding the dollar, which is a tax, so that sort of erodes wealth progressively.
Right. And then the last piece of that one was increasing the money supply. He says that was necessary. That's what's causing the inflation. But that you also have to counter that with more credit, because so consumer credit. So he's actually literally saying we got to print more money. Canadians got to be under more debt, and that will give us our 2% inflation. And that's our goal. It's
Yeah.
like, wow.
Yeah, no, and he was sort of saying there it is. I think I mean, the argument which will be interesting to see with Trump now is with Ron Paul and Doge is that there is that Overton window has shifted, and people are talking about why do we actually have the Fed in the U.S. And a lot of people don't realize that the Federal Reserve is actually private, and it goes back to the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks, and it's something that I believe it came out in 1913. So it's actually not that it hasn't always been around. But the whole point is that in the US, if they are potentially going to toggle to tariffs and phase out income tax, which seems like that might be something that'll happen, and they might even end the Fed. And I think they're trying to move towards a gold back currency again with the US dollar after Nixon took it off. What was it in 70, 71, 72, something like that. So it'll be what I guess what we'll see is that we're going to be probably the have-nots, and there'll be the haves in terms of just seeing, at least in the short term, I think we'll see a lot of prosperity in the U.S. if they do get rid of income tax, if they do go back to relying on tariffs, and if they preserve the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, and if we're going to go in the opposite direction, which is printing a bunch of money, like you said, with the deficit spending. I mean, what was it, 62 billion this last year with Freeland, and if we're just going to keep digging the hole deeper, increasing taxes on top of that, if Carney comes in, then that seems like a recipe for impoverishment.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I think Carney's working on. He's trying to connect the Canadian economy to the international banks, so International Monetary Fund, the Global Bank, and all of his cronies. I think that's the correct term for it,
Mhm.
around the world. He's trying to connect Canadians' economy to that and resources and future potential. And I think he might be successful. He might be successful because we doubled our deficit under Trudeau. We're up to over a trillion, I think, at this point now. And
1.3, I think is it. I think
oh
yeah.
yeah, just we need one of those big clocks like the Americans had that keeps going up to remind us what our
Thomas Massey has that debt counter on his lapel.
yeah, okay, I'm not surprised, okay, because that's exactly the direction we're headed. I do want to highlight though that I think that Trump is doing the right thing for America. And there's a small misconception on what tariffs really are for when it comes to the American side. There's a lot of media out there saying, hey, look, you're going to cause a lot of costs increase for consumers for certain goods and stuff like that for Americans. This is
Mhm.
a lot of the argument that came out of Trudeau and other things early. But the reality of it is, and we're seeing this happen today and yesterday with some announcements out of the White House, what they've done with this tariff is a lot of manufacturing and businesses are moving back to U.S. soil
Yeah,
and investing in U.S. Business now. 500 billion from Apple. It looks like Taiwan Semiconductors.
yesterday.
Yeah.
150
So
billion, I think it was.
well, so they added 100 billion to 65 billion in
That's right.
Arizona.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the purpose of tariffs. The tariffs aren't really to collect money on the border and goods coming in.
Mhm.
It's an incentive for the manufacturing and production and employment to happen within your country. Canada, it's not going to be well, it's going to hurt at the grocery store. Okay. A lot of things are going to go up in price, but our job market's going to tank.
Yeah, I think one of our biggest exports after oil and gas. And I mean, he's only tacking a 10% tariff on that, I think, because one third of the energy that they import in terms of oil and gas is from Canada. So they want to make sure that that's not going to dent their economy. But otherwise, it's vehicles and machinery. And those are things that Trump wants to build in-house anyways. So I
Yeah.
think that's one of our drivers. And then the second thing is metals, and it's like aluminum. I think we sell something like 3 million tons of aluminum to the US every year. And Russia, as part of this peace deal that they're hammering out now, has stepped in and said, look, we can offer you 2 million tons of aluminum. So they might not even have to source uh, metals from us, and that's one of the big things, or vehicles or machinery, and they might just look purely on oil and gas. So I agree with you. I think it's going to completely deflate the economy, and then if the view of Carney and the globalists is to go through deficit spending in response to that, just printing money, and I think Jagmeet Singh was talking about having some sort of a benefit, sort of it sounds like a UBI that they might want to usher in, which is again a
Yeah.
globalist policy. And again, if they want to put in a universal basic income, they're going to look at a mechanism for doing so. And then they can sort of slide in perhaps a digital ID as one of the mechanisms to say, look, we want to be able to give you a universal basic income, but we need to be able to uh, do so in a way that we can track and monitor it. And that's going to be through each person in Canada having a digital ID. So then presto, they create the emergency scenario where they have to come to the rescue, print more money, which again destroys the economy long term in Canada, but at the same time shoots two more arrows from the globalist agenda, which is UBI and digital IDs.
Now, I'm going to kind of tie this into a little bit of a morbid portion of this conversation. I was at Injections of Truth 2 yesterday here in Calgary. Several doctors, so Dr. Martin and Dr. Speaker. We saw Bridal, there's Dr. Bridal as well, and then Dr. Davidson. But one of the most important presentations was by Dr. Dini Rancor. And what he did was a lot of calculations of excess deaths and trying to find out like where are they coming from.
Hmm.
And one of the slides was really bad for Alberta because one of them he was able to tie it to the price of crude. So when the price of crude drops, deaths among mainly males in Alberta skyrockets. And he was able to show this that our economy and our job market and the price of crude is an issue across Canada that actually causes more death. So if you're, and this is weird and it's sad to look at it this way, but the numbers don't lie. If you depress a country and you make them literally depressed, like emotionally depressed, they take drugs, they hurt themselves, and sometimes they don't come back from that. Sometimes it's permanent. He was able to show even fentanyl deaths, how it would correlate with the job market. So if Canada goes through this, we are going through right now. And by the way, the 2nd of April is when more tariffs are going to kick in. The
Yeah.
reciprocal tariffs will kick in. So it's going to get even worse because we are brutal to the US when it comes to the tariffs we've already have in place prior to all of this. They're just going to now reciprocate.
And they're also going
Uh,
to ramp up. I think they said that 25% we're putting on them is for 30 billion, but there's a 21-day consultation. So sometime in the first half of next month, there's going to be another, I think, 120 billion of these tariffs that Canada's going to put on the US. And then, like you said, the reciprocal tariffs come in. So it's going to just keep ratcheting up.
Right. So, and if Denny Rancourt is correct, and he's got the numbers, it's not him that created the numbers, these are government death numbers. We should expect a lot of Canadians to die as our job market takes a hit, as oil takes a hit, as all of us takes a hit. And this is not even a paranoia. This is just, look, numbers don't lie. So when people are depressed, they take drugs, they hurt themselves. It's just the way it works. And Alberta specifically will be hit hardest with males, according to Daniel Rancourt's numbers. So I would encourage people to kind of check out the Injection of Truth and watch that presentation. I think it had 71 slides and providing the numbers. But in an economy that's depressed, especially like tariff war, we should expect an increase in mortality in Canada.
Yeah, the deaths of despair, I guess, is what they would get bucketed as.
Right. And we're going to end up with two major problems here. First, the job market is going to drop. We have over immigration. We're going to have tons of competition for what letter jobs are left. And then it's going to kind of self fulfill itself. It's going to be more depressing, more difficult. if the government is still providing subsidies for immigration, you're going to feel like a second-class citizen in your own country, and drink or fentanyl and other things are going to become part of your future and your path, and that's sad. And I do want to, if anybody's listening to this, please hang on. Things will get
Mhm.
better, but numbers are numbers. Excess deaths happen, and Danny Rincor exposed all of that yesterday in Alberta, and it was a really shocking moment for a lot of Albertans to watch because numbers don't lie. You can literally see in the excess deaths, like here's where the drop of oil price went down and it hurt the economy, and then you see suicide spike. It's like, oh boy.
Mm.
And if you were the person that was looking to, make a situation or environment where Canadians found themselves more dependent on things or hurt themselves, this is exactly what you do. You create a job market problem, you create a trade war, and you make it very difficult for Canadians. And that's what we're seeing happen right now, Pat.
And I think if you listen just on the topic of doctors, there's a lot of data that's out as well, and maybe we'll see it as part of the Trump administration's MAHA movement with RFK Jr. They're probably going to pull mRNA from the market, and I think they're going to do it perhaps. So what I've heard is they're not going to explicitly pull it. What they're going to do is they're going to put it into a trial phase to see what the impact is of them, and that's sort of part and parcel of Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s view that the vaccine schedule needs to get tested because his big criticism against Bill Gates, well, more Fauci, was that they don't test these vaccines. There's no long-term studies on them, and I think he might say, "Look, we're not going to ban mRNA." I know that there's Larry Ellison and Sam Altman was in the White House with Trump, and they were talking about mRNA vaccine, cancer vaccines. But I think if we let RFK Jr. find his feet, the view that I heard potentially is that they might actually just say, look, we're not banning them, but we're going to do some longer term trials to see what the impact is. And that in itself will address the issue where people will find that, look, they're not safe, they're not effective, and maybe that'll revisit it. But it's hard to say. I saw your shrug, and I know Elon Musk has been a big proponent of mRNA. So what are your thoughts?
Again, injection of truth. I'll point you to it, especially Dr. Speaker this time, because his was all about what is mRNA and what are lipid nanoparticles and what are their function. Like you hear these terms, but what do they actually do? And as it turns out, they're envelopes, they're delivery mechanisms for something else. And in these current vaccines, it was DNA. It was modifiers for DNA, SV40, and other things. So what it was basically a delivery system to get into your DNA and then to inject something into the DNA. It's a technology, okay? It's not medicine, it's a technology. And it's basically a way to enter your cells where your DNA is and then deliver something. What that something is, that's what they're going to start researching more on. Now, what I've heard from Robert and even, sorry, I didn't mean to call him Robert, but anyways, RFK Jr., is that they want to improve and advance that technology. So the messaging I think you're going to hear out of Robert Kennedy is we may have learned some lessons, but we're going to make this better. And what they're going to do is turn it into an improved technology using AI and all these other things that they're very happy about putting a lot of money behind because they believe it's a good technology to deliver things like cancer treatment and other things like they're being promised the future and this is where we can go. And this could be why Biden, in retrospect, said we're going to cure cancer in his term, because maybe he thought mRNA would have been successful during his term to do exactly that. That might have been where he got that idea from, because he said on the campaign trail, you elect him, he's going to cure cancer.
The
And he could
cancer
have been talking
moonshot.
about, yeah, he could be talking exactly about that.
Hmm.
Trump also, I'm going to bring you another part because you got to watch like everything Trump does, like all his executive orders to kind of put all these puzzles together, pieces together in the puzzle. Is he announced a sovereignty fund, wealth fund, sovereignty wealth fund. So the Americans are going to do similar to what you see in the Middle East. The
Asia
government
as well.
itself,
Yep.
yeah, they're going to have this fund where they invest and do this stuff and get returns. Because traditionally, governments aren't really there for profit; they're there for people. But now this wealth sovereignty wealth fund thing is for profit, and their intention is to grow wealth for America. During the signing of that, there was a comment that said, if we're going to order 2 billion doses, we may as well have some leverage against that and profit from that. So at that point, and this was like day 2 or 3 or so of Trump being in office, it was clear. vaccines are still going to continue. They're going to find ways to profit from it. And as you hear from Robert Kennedy, he's talking about improved vaccines and improved delivery mechanisms. So in my mind, if you were like a car manufacturer and you were trying to make an iterative process and a little bit better, you're not really going to focus a lot of time on the faults from before and oh we didn't have seat belts, let's slap ourselves for that, but now we've added seat belts. That's not really how progress works or innovation works. They take the approach of well let's learn from our mistakes and move forward. Never really let's learn from our mistakes and then find ourselves accountable. Like you didn't see car manufacturer CEOs going to prison because people died because there's no seatbelts, right? They just said, okay, well, we learned our lessons, let's move forward. I think you're going to see the same thing here. Yeah, okay, maybe there's some people died, there's vaccine injury, it didn't roll out great, we have some problems, but now here's the new and improved version. And I think Americans under Trump are going to buy that new chocolate bar that says new and improved. So they're
Perhaps.
going to continue with this. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I personally I don't think it's good. Okay. So after I was listening yesterday, their actual goal was to kill people. Genocide, an actual genocide. This is what was kind of highlighted by Dr. Martin, an American, that they've been doing this since 1965. These are all steps towards this. And if you go through his presentation, you won't have socks left because it was amazing what he was able to explain to us, which tells me whether Trump knows it or not, this is just another step in the progression of what the whole purpose of this was. And that is to change the DNA of Canadian, or not Canadians, anybody, like the
yeah.
whole globe. But I focus a lot on Canada, as you can see, and control them and have them perpetually needing something. And this something is going to be you got to get your vax every 6 months. And if you don't, your immune system's going to drop and then you're going to get sick and die. So you're going to see this kind of technology being exploited. I don't think they're going to go back and punish anybody. I think they're going to say, let's move forward with new technology. And that's still, I don't think that technology is going to be good for mankind.
Let's see how it goes. I followed that a little bit. I know the sovereign wealth fund that he was talking about the ways to fill up the tank, and he's looking at offsetting the 37 trillion there in debt. And I think Bitcoin and crypto is a big way, as well as um, possibly other things in terms of topping that up. But I agree. And also, just anybody that's watching this, when Jason was talking about SV40, that simian virus 40, and typically that's what scientists would use in laboratories in order to grow tumors. That's generally what it was used for, and that was found as an intentional ingredient. Maybe what we could do is just, I know we're coming up a little bit past the hour, to touch on one other point, because we are talking about the a lot on the US and what the implications will be with Canada. So, one thing that PPCers, or people that are supporting the People's Party, get a little bit of flack for, and I think and it's also something that's timely, is the fact that some people that are in favor of the People's Party of Canada are anti-globalist, you could say. So they're probably looking for
Oh,
an
for
option
sure.
outside the globalist party, one of the globalist parties, but they're also open to what Trump might be trying to architect right now, which is essentially, I think the globalists seem to be being able, they want more control, some would argue. So there's sort of this economic ruin because if people are more vulnerable, then they're also more open to having to giving away civil liberties. And so that's one angle for why they might be okay with these tariffs coming in, because they can bring in digital IDs, UBIs, and more deficit spending. But from Trump's perspective, I think if we put ourselves in his shoes, he might be looking at it from the perspective of having this North American security bloc. He's probably looking at resources. He's also looking at the fact that Russia now has hypersonics. They showcased Oreshnik, which is something the U.S. doesn't have, and so they might look at it from a different perspective, where we're going to enter into a phase of financial ruin and destitution for a short period of time, perhaps. But do you see annexation as a real thing? And I guess the people that might be in support of the PPC, some of whom are open to being annexed because they're seeing it as either it's the PPC, which is an anti-globalist party, or they're seeing a 51st state as also under a Trump administration as he takes a wrecking ball to globalism. So they're sort of seeing the destination might overlap in terms of we want to break free from globalism. What are your thoughts, and what have you come across in terms of people that might be open to both ideas?
So let's go back a couple decades. So as the European Union's being created and all these countries are coming together under one governance, basically, they have the European Union now. There was conversation about North American Union, and they even named the currency, the Amero. So if you look that up, that was a conversation a couple decades ago. Let's make these areas that all cooperate. Economic zones, I think, is the way they were kind of positioning it. Security zones too. And this is an old conversation about joining the U.S. In fact, if you look at the U.S. Constitution and a lot of the Canadian stuff since the very beginning, the U.S. has always been able to just, if Canada asks, the U.S. will basically let us in. There may be a couple checks and balances, but there's always been an open door policy to Canada to go ahead and join America at some point. So this isn't a new conversation that Trump has created. It's basically a really old one that's come up again. I am certainly not for on at this stage by choice joining the U.S., whether it's one province or the entire country. Annexation, that's such a very loaded conversation because that literally means boots on the ground across the border, which I don't think is even a potential possibility with NATO around, because that would have to trigger, I think, is Article 11, where they have to defend us.
I think
That would
Article 5.
five, okay. So
Yeah.
five, Article 11 comes up in another context. Okay, but Article
And I think
5
and,
is
and I think Article 5 is voluntary from what I heard because they were talking about this with basically the NATO bloc going into Ukraine with UK, France, and Canada and Australia, and whether or not the US would get dragged into World War III. And apparently there are people looking at it and they're saying it's potentially voluntary. But sorry, I'm interrupting. I always say, and some people are saying economic annexation, not necessarily. I don't think anybody foresees Abrams tanks coming and rolling across the border.
right, but economic annexation isn't a thing. But what is a thing is you push a country to the point where they decide to join. So they'll be consensual along those ways, those lines. Where I'm at right now, because of what's been exposed in Canada with our monarchy, the lack of leadership from the monarchy, which is part of our system, and the fact that we're going to have an unelected person take over the prime minister's office. He wasn't elected by the people. And we don't have a head of state that's Canadian. All these issues are coming together all at once, plus the Trump push. I think what we really are positioned for is having a conversation about removing the monarch from Canada and becoming a constitutional republic. Join a similar path that the U.S. had, and that is stand on your own 2 feet, be independent, fully be run by the people, for the people. And I think possibly because he's pushing not just Canada, but Greenland and Pamina as well. I think what his push is he wants a neighbor that has full control and development and are prospering with their development of their resources so that they can be a secure neighbor, one that is going to protect that border, not just from fentanyl and things like that, but from larger issues going forward. So I believe he wants America to feel safe from whoever. I think that the boogeyman of China or Russia or BRICS is heavy on Trump's mind, and he's wanting to make sure that Americans are safe and secure
Mhm.
because he is very America first. But this could be a great opportunity for Canadians to ditch the king. And there's a very big appetite in Alberta, and we saw this on the stage yesterday. Basically, every presenter at one point in their presentation said, "Your system failed you, and you may want to consider another one." Especially the American, David Martin, Dr. David Martin. He was
Mhm.
very clear on that your guys' system kind of failed you here. So I've started an initiative. It's called NotMyKing.ca. Max has taken the position that Charles is not his king, and Max has highlighted that the PPC party is a party that would head towards a republic. He did make it clear that there's lots of issues that need to be addressed as we make our way there. There's some that are far more important to address today, but headed in that direction is something that the PPC and only the PPC support, and that's because we are a populist party. that is anti-system, anti-establishment, and its establishment is a constitutional monarchy. All the other parties, not just on Ukraine and fighting Trump, but all the other parties agreed to keep the current system. So this is what makes the PPC very different from all the other parties, is we do see a future in Canada where we are independent in our own 2 feet. I do thank the people that are pushing for the 51st state, whether it's just Alberta or Canada, because they already agree we shouldn't be a monarch. Because if you do want to be an American state, we have to get rid of the monarch. So at least there's overlap there on a lot of Canadians of one step that we do really do agree on. It's time to leave the Commonwealth. And as this rhetoric continues, and you hear things like Freeland saying, we're going to work with our nuclear friends, the ones that have
Mhm.
nuclear weapons, because we do feel threatened by the US. As long as those kind of conversations are headed in that direction, Canadians are going to realize whether we won't be elected. We don't have to select a war. We're going to get pulled into one. So if that happens, Europe goes into war, something bad happens over there, Canadians are going to be sent there for sure.
Well, that's
And this
happening
might,
right now. Or sorry to interject. I was saying, I mean, it seems as though Italy's just bowed out, but France, the UK, Australia, and Canada, they're all talking about putting in peacekeepers in Ukraine. And some would argue that that's because they're looking to have essentially world war, and that would allow them to have a financial reset, which is typically coincides with any of the great wars that have happened. So if you get to the teetering point, then they could bring in a new financial system, or like I said. But yeah, just wanted to add that. Please carry on.
sure. And what they call peacekeepers, what they actually mean is they're going to create a DMZ along the eastern border of Ukraine with Russia, much like North Korea, and it's going to be always under tension. And both sides are going to be providing a lot of equipment, matching tank for tank, basically, and missile for missile. And as one builds up, the other builds up. And it's always going to be called peacekeeping because there's nobody firing at that stage. But you're asking for trouble. Both countries put in a whole bunch of economic efforts into militarizing the borders, and instead of building their economy and rebuilding cities and those kind of things, it's going to be a perpetual war, or at least a perpetual state of almost at World War III. I'm not surprised that Italy bowed out, okay, because she's a very smart woman who's leading that country. But I don't think they came out aggressive enough to condone the idea of forming a peacekeeping mission, because I think that peacekeeping mission, it's not really peacekeeping, it is war prolonging, because peace would be nobody's at the border because there's no need for that. That would be peace. This would be prolonging the war. It's just changed. They changed the label. They
And
may
they
not
also
be
said
firing at.
correct. Well, I was just going to say they mentioned peacekeepers with air support, and so that seems going back to Article 5. I mean, it seems uh, that a lot of issues could potentially happen. And I think it was today that Russia actually had a ballistic missile strike on a military base in Ukraine where 30 foreign military advisors, maybe they were special forces or trainers, they were killed,
Oh
and
well.
there's 100 something. So I mean, that's before this even happens. So I agree with you that that could unravel. And if you said this perpetual state of war, like, gosh, that sounds a lot like Orwell's 1984 to me.
Yeah, I put a post exactly that, and I even made up a song. This is the war that never ends. It
Oh.
goes on and on, my friend, and then repeat, because that's exactly what they're looking for here. Now, when Trump says he doesn't want to provide security to Ukraine, but Ukraine says we need security in order to have a peace deal. What Ukraine means is a DMZ, demilitarized zone. They want a lot of equipment on that border. That's what Ukraine is asking for. So when Trump says you don't want peace, he's correct, because peace would be there's no need for anything at the border. And what Trump is doing, which I don't know if it's a good strategy or not, but he's basically saying we're going to be human shields. So we're going to come in there and start doing some business, and Russia will never attack you because we're in there. And if we get hurt while we're in there, then maybe we'll take action. That's the deterrent that Trump thinks is going to be acceptable to allow the Ukraine to no longer be under attack. I don't know if that's wise or not, but that's where Zelensky's concerns are. He doesn't think that these American miners that are in there digging rare earth are going to be good enough human shields to deter Putin from doing anything. And this is why they want to have a DMZ.
I've heard
I
a different
hope.
angle. Or sorry, could I jump in? Because I had a little bit of a different take on that recently. On this is the rare earth. Basically, so Zelensky had gone to the White House recently, and the Trump administration was trying to have a rare earth deal signed
Mhm.
with Ukraine, where they would basically get, I think it was 50% rights to them. And then Zelensky got there and said, "Look, we don't want to have a ceasefire and then sign this." But it seems as though that Zelensky, some would argue, is actually someone that was actually put in place, if you look back by the globalist administration, that you can trace that back to the Maidan coup in 2014, and the same globalists that are currently trying to perpetuate world war by bringing basically assembling NATO on the Ukraine border and escalating with Russia. And so it seems as though the person that they put in charge is the same person that's saying what they want to say,
Mhm.
and perhaps that's the reason. And I think Russia countered that by saying, "Look, we actually have more rare earth minerals than Ukraine does, anyways, and we currently have a deal in place for rare earth minerals with China, but we're happy to give you the primary lead on that." And that was something that happened yesterday. So I think that's. I do firmly believe that Trump and Putin are actually trying to hammer this out and de-escalate this because they see that they're on the precipice of world war the way things are going with NATO.
There's a whole bunch there too as well. And first, I just want to remind everybody that when you're watching that Oval Office and Zelensky and Trump having their back and forth, those two gentlemen at one point were reality TV stars, both of them. Okay. So they're both capable of playing to a camera and being very careful what they're saying and invoking emotion and other things. So I just want to put that out there. Zelensky being put in, and he's currently a dictator because he's not even allowing elections and having the people have a say in what's going on in their country is a problem. But I think one of the major concerns here is you're right because the globalists do want forever war, and this is where the Orwell's quote comes in because if you keep people starving in poverty, they'll basically do whatever you need.
Mm.
And when you have a perpetual war where you're always sending people there and you're always in a state of emergency, you're not doing your best as a country or as Europe. You're going to be spending a lot of resources where it's kind of like wasted. I think what Trump's trying to do, and I don't know if Biden played a role in this because there was a real good bait and switch that happened. The bait was you can have free money. Okay, that's what Biden did to Ukraine. The switch was we want that money back with Trump. And that caused Ukraine to get into a very weird position. And I don't know if this was globalist planned or not, but it forced them to basically give up resources. And this is what I want to warn Canadians of. If we get into debt with like an international monetary fund or the US or other countries, this is exactly what they do is they want resources. They want to dibs on it. And it's more than just rights to it. I believe they have a second or no first rights to any deal that comes in, but they also have a 50% deal as well.
Yeah.
So they will be taking out 50% of all the rare earth. That's why Trump is saying we're going to be there taking it out, and this should be a deterrent to Russia from attacking because Americans are going to be working there. So they're getting 50% of the minerals. And I don't know if it's up to 350 billion or whatever the amount is, but it's also first right to any other deal. So if China comes in for the other 50% or 10% of the other 50%, the US could go ahead and take that deal. So they will actually be able to increase the amount that they're taking out of Ukraine over time. This is why I call it a bait and switch, because that was a perfect thing for Trump to walk into for negotiation purposes to get quite the deal for the Americans. They basically prepaid for their future at bargain basement prices, the prices of today. They're not going to be paying tomorrow's prices. They're going to pay today's prices because the money's been put up ahead of time. It's like buying bulk. If you go buy bulk today, you've locked in at today's price. If the price goes up tomorrow, that's good for you. And rare earth minerals all over the place is going to go up as demand goes up. So quite the deal if you look at it just from a business standpoint. And it was a
It's
good bait and
interesting.
switch. Now
Hmm.
to just finish up this conversation about the war itself, can it end? It probably could, but I don't think it will. I think this is exactly where the European Union with Canada is heading, peacekeeping. They're going to call it peacekeeping. And that's what you're going to see happen for quite some time. You may not have 2,000 deaths a week like you have right now, but you're going to have a perpetual cost. Um, You're going to see a lot of resources spent there. And if just one guy is trigger happy one day, it's going to have a skirmish and you're going to see a bunch of deaths. And we see this all over the place, all over history. Whenever there's tension at a border and there's a lot of military at the border, sometimes you just have a bad day and some people die. So that won't be peace. Peace would be nobody's at the border because there's no need. There's a good peace agreement between countries and they're focused on building their countries. I don't know if we'll get there. I really don't. I hope so. But what I like to do is leave the Commonwealth. I like Canada to make these decisions, and I would like these kind of things put to the Canadian people so we can actually have a say on whether or not we want to be peacekeepers, for example. These are decisions that should come from the Canadian people, not leadership or globalist alliances like NATO. And we may be a few steps away from seeing NATO dissolve. NATO may dissolve. The U.S. leave it. Um, we may see it dissolve, and that would be true peace. So if we get to the point where NATO's dissolving, we're headed towards peace. But as long as NATO exists, with or without the U.S., there's a threat to the Russians. The Russians have a right to defend themselves from threats. We have a perpetual war. So those are the triggers I'm looking for. And I didn't mean to use that particular word, but those are the key performance indicators I'm looking for to see how this is going to happen and which way we're going to head.
And just on that, we might see that tonight. Trump has an address to Congress, and one of the things that he's alluding to, or there's rumors of, is that he's going to perhaps put step back or actually step away from NATO. I think right now the U.S. funds something like 70% of all NATO funding. So if he's out and Italy's kind of stepping back, and there may be some other countries. Do you see anything in it seems that we're going to see a very kind of shaky interim over maybe the next 12 months where Canada's already said that they're all of the party leaders are in favor of going into Ukraine or at least
Yeah.
in perpetuating that. You've got France, you've got the UK, and you've got Australia that have all spoken out in favor of that. Then you kind of have the Nordic countries that might be sitting on the fence. But I mean, do you see you just view this as perpetual, even if the U.S. withdraws, if the U.S. has a deal with Russia to basically, they're probably going to have rare. I think Russia has more rare earth minerals than Ukraine does, and Putin's giving him the offer of giving the U.S. priority over China to go into Russia. So there's a big upfront cost to go into that. But the U.S. might not have any interest. They might say, look, we already have all of these rare earth mineral rights in Russia, and that eclipses what's available in Ukraine. You sort of have at it to the NATO guys and just say, look, this is going to be your mess, and we're not gonna involve ourselves. Do you see that potentially happening?
I do. And if we see NATO dissolve, and that's part of the announcement tonight, that'll be some good news. But look, the U.S. you can't, two things cannot be true at once. What, they can't nationalize and bring industry to their country and not have imports of minerals and material. You
Hmm.
can't build a national because they don't have the material
Gotcha.
in their land, in their
Yeah.
borders. So they can't build up national and industry without importing. So there's going to have to be a way for that to happen, whether it's Greenland, Canada, Europe, Ukraine, others. There's always going to be a market for the U.S., a heavy market, a strong market to be importing this stuff. So that's his longer term plan. He wants to build America up inside their border, but they don't have all the raw material for that. So they're focusing on gathering that from multiple locations, because I do think what Trump has in mind is a very large rebound of the U.S. economy and industrialization, and they're going to need to fuel that with raw material.
Hmm. Interesting times. I know we're kind of coming up to the chunk of time we wanted to chat for an hour and a half. This has been great. I feel like we could go for another
That
hour
always happens, my
potentially.
friend. That
Yeah.
always happens with good conversations. They go by quick for
Yeah.
starters. This went by fast,
Hmm.
and it doesn't seem like there's a natural end. But I do have to get ready for my other shows for today because I have an excellent couple of guests. Oh no, three guests tonight. I've
Okay.
got Bathsheba Vandenberg, who's a lawyer out of Alberta. She's known for being the Freedom Corp lawyer at the POEC. She's Detective Helen Gruse's lawyer out of Ottawa, and she's also part of the team that took on the government with the Mosley decision. And she'll be talking about the Mosley appeal. And what we also have is Vincent Gersey, who's the plaintiff on that matter, and Eddie Cornell, who's a plaintiff on that matter. So we're going to have all three of them on talking about the Mosley decision. And if your audience isn't familiar with that, that's a decision that showed that Trump, or not Trump, sorry, we're talking America too much. Trudeau overstepped and was ultra virus with his actions with the Emergency Act and attacking Canadians' bank accounts mainly. So we'll be getting into that appeal because the government appealed it. The arguments were put in just last month, and now we're waiting for a decision. So I'll have to prepare for that conversation. But I'm optimistic that Canada is going to head in the right direction, and I'm looking forward to speaking to one of the lead lawyers on that.
Excellent. That's going to be a great chat. I know that I'm following Vincent on X, so I'll tune in once it's available to see how that goes. But I really appreciate your time. It was great chatting. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do it again. But this was a lot of fun.
My pleasure, Pat, and thanks for reaching out. And good luck with your show, and congratulations on being a candidate. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the House of Commons.
Likewise. Thanks, Jason.